the situation for low-income countries with importers that depend on Black Sea cereals to ensure access to food in the short term. Now, there will be other costs arising from the crisis. Supporting refugees, shielding consumers, increasing energy and digital security, or even defense. Those are costs that will vary across countries, but for all, they will require resources. Countries differ in how they're affected by this crisis, in the tools they have at hand, and their cyclical positions. Some countries may have the option to fund some of this spending with an exceptional tax on windfall profits on energy companies gaining from the high prices. Some will use fiscal space. Some will need to divest resources. And some of this will need to be joint EU action. But the key message here is that fiscal policy is best placed to address these needs. Our simulation suggests that well-designed fiscal measures would curtail some of the consequences of the shock on the left with minimum inflation impact, the green bar on the right. So let me now go into the details of targeted measures that we recommend. The most immediate policy priority is to ensure that vulnerable households who spend a very high share of their income on food and energy, you can see on the left, can cope. In light of the high energy prices in the past month, many governments have already introduced a range of measures to mitigate the rise in prices, and that's on the right. But among those, what are the ones we do recommend? First, means-tested, targeted, and temporary measures for supporting food and energy purchases. We recommend caution with general tax reductions, which benefit those that may not need it, blur market prices, and are fiscally more expensive than targeted transfers. They may be quicker to implement in emergency, but it will need to evolve if the crisis persists. Now, protecting vulnerable consumers is a pressing short-term issue, but that is not a sustainable energy policy response. A sustainable response will require to address the source of vulnerability in this crisis, namely to cut the dependence on Russian energy sources, gas, oil, and coal. That cannot be done overnight, but there are things we can do now to significantly reduce dependency on Russian gas and oil, which you can see on the left. Diversifying external and domestic energy sources, like postponing the phase-out of nuclear plants planned for this year and next, and improving energy efficiency and better managing demand. Now, to ensure energy security over the medium term, we will not only need to continue moving away from dependency on Russia, but also moving away from dependency on fossil fuels. And for this, we need much more private and public investment in energy efficiency, demand flexibility, interconnections, clean energy, and innovation. And here, I'd like to note that a low-cost way to encourage more private sector energy investment is greater certainty in tax policies and regulations. And last, I think we need to be realistic. For the transition, we need more LNG terminals to allow gas supplier diversification and more storage to buffer the shock. So there's obviously no one-size-fits-all, but European countries urgently need to work on their energy security together. It will cost, but this has to be a top common EU priority. Now let me conclude. The world appears to be exiting the 2-year COVID-19 pandemic shock, but only to be hit with a brutal and devastating war in Europe. We do not yet know how this will fully play out for the global economy, but what we do know is that there are devastating humanitarian costs and profound changes to the global order, which had previously helped billions of people live in peace. Thank you.
We'll now turn to the questions. For those journalists online, please use the Zoom chat facility. For the journalists in the room, please call for the microphone. We'll start with a question from Will Horrobin from Bloomberg. You talk of a scenario where all energy exports from Russia could get cut off. What would be the appropriate policy responses for central banks and governments if that transpires?
So I think what we've said is, this is a supply shock, and fiscal policy is best placed to address these shocks. Now, before the crisis, we had different situations in different countries, but mostly high growth and in some cases inflation. So let me say briefly three groups of countries, right? Those countries which had very strong economic growth, low unemployment, high inflation, monetary policy should continue the course of normalization and reducing the support. For example, that's what we saw with the US yesterday. In countries like in Asia, where we have growth, fairly fair growth, and we have low inflation, then monetary policy can continue its course unchanged. In Europe, what we need to do, where the uncertainty is the highest, we need to assess the evolution of the crisis. So if something like that would be to happen, obviously the central bank will look at the data and effect and reassess its monetary policy course.
Yeah, so the key point here is it's not a one-size-fits-all situation. Clearly, if in that sort of scenario where oil and gas supply from Russia will be completely cut off from one day to the next, the impact across Europe would be severe in terms of economic activity, but it would be different in different parts of Europe. And the modeling and the simulation that Laurence presented before shows how different parts of Europe would be impacted in different ways depending on their level of current dependence. And I guess that's why we say it's so important for Europe to very swiftly think about the medium to longer term reforms required to ensure energy security, energy autonomy, affordability, at the same time as also maintaining the pathway to carbon neutrality by 2050. It's a significant challenge, but there is a need to reassess and to re-examine current policy settings to ensure that the policy settings are adjusted so that they're fit for purpose.
There are a number of questions on the risk of recession in the world and in Europe, particularly if the war drags on.
Well, we've made a conscious decision, and Laurence will add further to this. We made a conscious decision not to provide projections today because of the evolving situation. What we've presented today is a simulation based on the facts and the information as we currently know it. It's an evolving situation, and the impact that Laurence has spelled out is about 1% negative impact on GDP, on world GDP as a result of the war, based on the information we have to date, and an impact of about 2.5% in terms of inflation. Now, back in December, we projected GDP growth for 2022 globally of 4.5%, but we are not providing updated numbers here today because in between updates, there are always a whole range of factors moving in different directions. What we are doing here is presenting an assessment based on a macroeconomic modeling exercise on what the forward outcomes are likely to be based on the information that we have to date. And given all of the things that we don't know about how this continues to evolve moving forward, it wouldn't be useful to try and provide a number or numerical projection about future growth at this point in time. Laurence?
To add, I think what is important to keep in mind is how uncertain the situation is and how fast it can evolve. One thing where we have been surprised so far is the lack of reaction of financial market. And that, I think, is a reflection of the uncertainty that is out there, which is why I would take this opportunity to actually say, to complete the earlier question, that should financial market actually become more volatile or shaky because of an exogenous event due to the worsening of the conflicts or something else, then central banks do have a role in actually stabilizing those financial markets in these circumstances.
We've got a question from the room, from the journalists in the room. If they could have a microphone, please.
Thank you. Is it working? Rina Basit from a Monitor. You were talking about cutting dependence of Russian energy sources and diversifying energy sources and so on, and measures for short-term and long-term. But how much does all of this really depend on the actions or measures taken by European governments? And how much does it really depend on OPEC setting prices?
Well, I mean, there's certainly a need to diversify energy supplies away from Russia. I think that is very obvious. I mean, there are, in terms of gas supplies, I mean, there are alternative options available. I mean, Norway, Algeria, other parts of the world could substitute some of the energy supplies that are currently coming from Russia, but ultimately, I mean, you know, there is no alternative to making some of these judgments. But there will indeed. This will be best addressed if there is proper coordination and cooperation, and if there is, obviously a focus on all of the potential alternative sources of supply that could substitute for what would be lost in that scenario. Laurence.
Thank you. So I think if you look at the 10-point plan of our sister agency, the IEA, on how to reduce gas dependency in 1 year, which is what I was mentioning, that helps reducing about 30% of the gas dependency just with what we have now, because you're right, I mean, we cannot import tons of LNG from one country overnight. Now, it would take about 2 to 5 years really to cut off from Russia. We have to be realistic. But there are things we can start doing very quickly and which have been pending for a long time. I'm thinking, because of the question you asked, to the connection between Spain and Portugal and the rest of Europe, with the LNG pipeline. And that's obviously something, for example, that can be taken up at the European level, because it's not only to provide gas from Spain and Portugal, who have some to France, but to Germany and all those countries that are also that are very dependent on gas. So I think, there's a series of projects like that which have been pending for a long time. It is now a matter of urgency for the European Union to look into this, and European governments to actually make that move.
Well, the key here really is there are options, but it's I mean, this circumstance, this crisis now forces authorities to, I guess, make some decisions more quickly than they otherwise might have.
A question from Denise Lopez from El País. The document you are publishing today talks about the possible taxation of windfall gains in order to reduce the negative impact on growth. Could you specify the sectors or companies?
Well, I mean, this goes back to the issue that was identified by the International Energy Agency in the context of their 10-point plan. If you look at what is happening in Europe with the linkage between gas prices and electricity prices, and the way electricity prices move up with increases in gas prices, I mean, there are expected windfall gains estimated by the International Energy Agency to the tune of potentially 200 billion euros, not linked to any increases in costs for a significant part of the electricity sector. So there is the opportunity to help fund temporary, targeted, sensible measures to support and to shelter the impact of increased electricity prices for vulnerable households by temporary revenue measures targeting windfall gains that are directly linked to the current market design when it comes to the energy market across Europe. I mean, that is really what the International Energy Agency has identified as a short-term measure. But I stress here the other point that Laurence made before is very, very important. While this can be an effective short-term measure, ultimately there is a need over the medium to long term to reassess the appropriate policy settings for the energy market in Europe to ensure that energy security, affordability, and the transition to carbon neutrality can be maintained in the best possible way. Follow-up question over there.
A follow-up question, yeah, sure.
Maybe I didn't explain myself well. My question is, I understand very well all the projects that you want to fast track, maybe projects that were already being prepared and you are going to fast track them. My question is, are all these measures, how much efficient will they be as long as OPEC keeps setting its prices as it wants? Most of them are not members of the OECD. So how efficient are the measures you are envisaging as long as this is not resolved? I mean, some of these countries are, I don't know, I don't want to use the word rejoicing over the hike prices, but obviously benefiting from it.
Well, I mean, obviously the more countries around the world act in concert to deal with the impact of this war on energy prices, the better. And certainly, I mean, there is a lot of capacity across OECD member countries to contribute to the solution. But you're right. I mean, there are other stakeholders around the world that we would hope will step up to help find the most sensible way forward. I mean, there's nothing really truly efficient about dealing with the impact of an unprovoked military attack. This is not, we're not finding ourselves in an ideal scenario here. So if your question is, you know, are there going to be problems that will be difficult to solve? The answer is yes. Will it best be able to be addressed by countries and organizations and stakeholders from all around the world coming together to determine the best possible ways forward? Of course. Will there be challenges and difficulties along the way? Yes. But there is an urgent need to act in order to prevent or minimize, I should say, in order to minimize the negative impacts on households across Europe, but in other parts of the world as well.
Perhaps I could add, you have two issues here. You have one for oil and one for gas. For oil, it's a worldwide issue, right? So the rise in oil prices at some stage will also trigger some production elsewhere. And OPEC has to strike the right balance between keeping some revenues and actually, not shifting away some of the revenue they have to other parts of the world. And I think that's where open market and competition is actually important. There's another lesson from this from oil too, actually. One is that's why we insist on moving away from fossil fuel, because you don't want to shift your dependency from Russia to another supplier. And on the way, having better storage than what we had so far may be an option. On gas, one last thing about this as well. It will take some time to adjust because it's different shipping routes. So there are also something that we need to think about the logistic. On gas, it's less easy to diversify. And I'm not saying oil is right. A lot of oil refineries in Europe can refine Russian gas or Middle East, but not US oil, or Middle East, but not US one. So we also have to keep in mind that there's these changes behind. Gas is also not very easy to diversify, and it also needs better pipeline and interconnection. And I think for the European Union, one of the most crying issue is that one. But the bottom line is, moving away from fossil fuel and not shifting dependency to other countries is key.
Tom Rees of the Daily Telegraph in the UK. Does the OECD expect this crisis to accelerate deglobalization trends, and will that have a negative impact on economies?
Well, that is certainly one of the risks, and that we have to guard against. And if it were to eventuate, it would have a negative impact. It would have a further negative impact on the global economic outlook. And so, I mean, our key message here is let's be very calm in the way we respond to this. Let's be very considered. Let's keep our commitment to keeping markets open. Let's reject a move towards protectionism, because it will make a difficult situation only worse. Laurence.
Yeah, perhaps a couple of things to add to this. One is the most striking measure that has been taken in this crisis is cutting Russia from the international payment system through the central bank and through SWIFT, right? And as we all know, other countries have started building up their own international or their own payment system that they wish to become international. So I think it's a fact that some countries will actually move away as an insurance policy to other international or regional payment system, and that's a fragmentation for sure. It's the same with trade finance. We're seeing very clearly in the way that insurers or ship managers are getting into this crisis. There's less trade. Some people are not taking the risk of insuring or moving boats from conflict areas. So you may have some regionalization there as well. And we have pending for a long time the issue of different digital regulation around the world, and that's also creating some fragmentation. So there's no... I mean, we all agree that globalization has brought huge benefit, and not least lifting a third of the world population out of poverty. But there are some signs with the COVID and with what's happening now that this may not be what the future will look like, or at least it will be a different one.
A question from the Hungarian media, Nabi. The European Union is also encouraging member states to intensify diversifying energy investments to distance themselves from Russia. Do you think that should be achieved with a massive increase in debt?
Well, there's certainly an urgent need to diversify energy supplies away from Russia, and that will necessarily involve a level of investment. And obviously the capacity to finance that is something that has to be part of the consideration as plans are put in place.
You want me to add? Okay, a couple of things. I think two points are really important. One is the energy system in Europe is should be, I should say, a single market. So that means it's a joint work, right, where all EU countries have to take part, because obviously the more you have renewables, the more you have to rely on each other to regulate demand. So it's a common EU project. Now the question of debt. Investment projects that require and will benefit several generations, you can envisage that some of them are financed by debt, and it's normal, right? Because you spread the cost over a generation, but that's for public investment. But as we were saying earlier, a lot of private investment have to come in for the energy transition, and there's nothing better, and that doesn't cost anything, that tax and regulation certainty to crowd in private investment.
A question from Christian Chavagneux from Alternative Économique. Russian gas is still being delivered. Why are prices staying high? Uncertainty, speculation, both. Do you think price controls could be a temporary solution?
Well, firstly, I mean, it's all of the above. There will be a level of speculation based on what the expectations are of the future. There's a risk premium clearly that is starting to come into the equation, and there are some real supply pressures that have started to play out. We don't believe that distorting market interventions should be part of the solution, because they will make a challenging situation even worse. I mean, yes, we should take steps to protect vulnerable households, in particular from some of the impacts through temporary fiscal support measures, but imposing price caps or pursuing other measures will cause counterproductive distortions, which will ultimately lead to negative outcomes and not help us get into the position we need to get to over the medium to long term.
Juste deux points additionnels. Dans la hausse des prix qu'on voit, effectivement, il y a une anticipation de ce qui va se passer du côté de l'offre et des tensions additionnelles qu'on pourrait avoir ou des sanctions additionnelles qu'on pouvait avoir. Donc, effectivement, on voit certains prix de marché qui peuvent être plus élevés que ce qu'une analyse pourrait donner. Ça peut être de la spéculation au sens où on l'entend en français de jouer avec les marchés, mais ça peut aussi être juste de l'anticipation avec des entreprises qui ont besoin de se couvrir. Et ça, on n'est pas capable de faire la différence entre les deux. Mais ce que ça veut dire profondément, en plus de ce que Mathias vient de dire, c'est que les prix vont rester très volatiles pendant cette période à cause de l'incertitude. Donc il faut s'attendre à avoir cette volatilité. C'est pour ça que les mesures de court terme sont importantes. Mais à nouveau, et comme c'était dit, il est important de se déplacer de cette dépendance qui en fait pénalise tout le monde, les personnes, les entreprises, leur compétitivité aussi.
A question on the utility of the G20. Richard Io of Les Échos. Vous parlez de coopération internationale. Le forum du G20 est-il toujours la bonne enceinte pour cette coopération? Faut-il créer un nouveau forum?
Firstly, the G20 is an incredibly important forum in that it brings, 85% of the global economy together to help identify solutions and way forwards in relation to the various challenges the world is facing. I mean, clearly, right now, the war in Ukraine, Russia's war against the people of Ukraine, makes it very difficult for that forum to operate effectively. But, we will need into the future effective international cooperation. We will need effective global governance, and I do hope that the international community can find a way back to working together peacefully to address many issues that can only be addressed through effective global cooperation. I mean, we're not going to address or be able to address a challenge like climate change effectively unless across Europe, the US, Canada, China, India, Russia, Brazil, and others, we all work together on a broadly coordinated approach to address that challenge. And I mean, the G20 has been a very effective forum. Hopefully, on the other side of this war, there will be a way found to make that forum as effective again into the future as it hasn't been in the past.
And I think we'll just take one more question. This is from Assis Moreira of Valor Econômico in Brazil. What is the impact on Latin America? Is it in a better situation since the region exports commodities?
Certainly. I mean, look, the effect of this war in terms of the global economic outlook in aggregate is negative. But it is true that for some countries with lesser direct exposure to Russia or Ukraine, and who sell commodities that are attracting high prices, I mean, there will be some beneficial impact in terms of their export earnings and their trade balances. But, the overall effect in aggregate is negative all around, but there are variations depending on where you are in the world. That's certainly true.
I think we'll close there. Thank you all very much for coming to the press conference and for tuning in online. As usual, there is a lot of material on the website. Thank you.
Thank you.